the cold barrel of a shotgun pressed against Lillian Everett's temple as the stagecoach rattled to a halt, and in that moment, she realized this day would not be like any other. The year was 1875, and the Arizona Territory was unforgiving to those who traveled its dusty trails unprepared or unlucky. "Nobody move," a masked man shouted, his voice muffled by the bandana covering the lower half of his face. "This is a robbery." Lillian sat rigid, her breath catching in her throat as the outlaw's calloused fingers snatched the gold locket from around her neck, the last gift her father had given her before consumption took him 3 winters ago. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "That locket, it's all I have left of him." The outlaw's eyes, cold as river stones, met hers. "Should have stayed home then, miss. Ain't nothing but heartache out here in these parts." As quickly as they had appeared, the bandits vanished into the scrubby landscape, leaving behind a shaken driver and 5 passengers with considerably lighter pockets. Lillian stared at the emptiness where her precious locket had hung, feeling the familiar numbness of loss creep through her chest. "Everyone all right?" the driver called back, his voice trembling slightly. When no one answered with anything worse than curses or tears, he flicked the reins. "Reckon we best get moving before they change their minds and come back for the horses." The stagecoach lurched forward, and Lillian turned her gaze to the endless expanse of red rock and sage that stretched toward the horizon. 3 days ago, she had left behind everything familiar in Boston to answer an advertisement for a schoolteacher in the frontier town of Copper Creek. Now, with each passing mile, the doubts grew stronger. The elderly woman beside her patted Lillian's hand. "First time out west, dear," Lillian nodded, blinking back tears of frustration. "Is it that obvious? The nice dress gave you away," the woman said kindly. "Don't you fret about those bandits. They're just part of the territory, like rattlesnakes and dust storms." "I'm beginning to think this was a terrible mistake," Lillian admitted. "Perhaps I should have stayed in Boston after all." "What brings a fine young lady like yourself out to these rough parts?" "A teaching position in Copper Creek. After my father passed, there wasn't much left for me back east." Lillian straightened her shoulders. "I thought it would be an adventure." The woman chuckled. "Well, you certainly got one sooner than expected. I'm Martha Winslow, by the way. My husband and I run the general store in Copper Creek." Lillian Everett. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Winslow, despite the circumstances." "Call me Martha, dear, and don't you worry about that locket. Things have a way of working themselves out in mysterious ways out here." Lillian managed a weak smile, though she didn't share the older woman's optimism. If this was how her Western adventure began, she could only imagine what might follow. The stagecoach arrived in Copper Creek just as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town's single dusty street. Lillian stepped down, her legs stiff from the journey, and surveyed what would be her new home. A row of weathered buildings lined each side of the street: a general store, a saloon, a small church, and various other establishments, their wooden facades bleached by years of relentless sun. Martha's husband, a jolly man with a thick white beard, greeted them warmly. "Welcome to Copper Creek, Miss Everett. I'm Harold Winslow. The whole town's been looking forward to your arrival." "Thank you, Mr. Winslow. I hope I can live up to everyone's expectations. Now, we've arranged for you to stay at Mrs. Prescott's boarding house until the schoolteacher's cottage is ready," Martha explained. "It's just down the street, and she serves the best apple pie this side of the Mississippi." As Harold loaded Lillian's trunk onto a small wagon, a commotion at the far end of the street drew everyone's attention. A group of cowboys rode into town, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. In the lead was a tall man on a striking black stallion, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. "That'll be the Tucker boys bringing in some cattle to sell," Harold explained. "They run the biggest ranch in these parts." Lillian watched as the cowboys dismounted outside the saloon, their spurs jingling with each step. The leader paused, turning in her direction as if sensing her gaze. Even from a distance, she could feel the intensity of his stare before he tipped his hat slightly and disappeared into the saloon. "Who was that?" Lillian asked, surprised by her own curiosity. "That's Thomas Tucker," Martha said, a knowing smile playing at her lips. Took over the family ranch when his pa passed 5 years back, finest horseman in the territory and stubborn as the day is long. And unmarried, Harold added with a wink that earned him an elbow from his wife. Don't you go getting ideas, Harold Winslow, Martha scolded. Miss Everett isn't here for courting, she's here to teach our children. Lillian felt heat rise to her cheeks. Indeed, I am. Romance is the furthest thing from my mind, I assure you, and it was true. After watching her mother waste away from grief following her father's death, Lillian had vowed never to allow herself to become so dependent on another person. Love was a fool's game that left even the strongest people broken and hollow. The school's just over there, Harold pointed to a small building with a bell tower. Classes start Monday morning. As they made their way to the boarding house, Lillian couldn't help but glance back toward the saloon. This Thomas Tucker might be the finest horseman in the territory, but she hadn't come all this way to lose her heart or her independence to a cowboy with intense eyes and a black stallion. The following days passed in a flurry of activity as Lillian prepared for her first day of teaching. Mrs. Prescott's boarding house proved to be clean and comfortable, and the widow herself was a font of local knowledge, much of which Lillian suspected was embellished for dramatic effect. That Thomas Tucker, Mrs. Prescott remarked over breakfast on Sunday morning, rescued the mayor's son when he fell down an abandoned mine shaft last spring, lowered himself down on a rope without a second thought for his own safety. Lillian nodded politely, having heard no fewer than 3 tales of the rancher's alleged heroism since her arrival. He seems well regarded in town. Well regarded, Mrs. Prescott laughed. Half the unmarried women between here and Tucson have set their caps for him, but he doesn't pay them any mind. Some say he's still grieving his sweetheart who died of fever before they could marry. How tragic, Lillian murmured, though she couldn't help but wonder if there was any truth to the story or if it was just another embellishment to the Tucker legend. After breakfast, Lillian decided to visit the schoolhouse to ensure everything was in order for the following day. The morning air was crisp, and the town was quiet, most residents attending Sunday services at the small white church. The schoolhouse was unlocked, as Martha had promised it would be. Inside, rows of simple wooden desks faced a larger desk and blackboard at the front of the room. Bookshelves lined one wall, though they held far fewer volumes than Lillian had hoped. She made a mental note to write to her former colleagues in Boston to request donations. As she was examining the meager teaching supplies in the desk drawer, the door creaked open. Lillian looked up, expecting to see Martha or one of the other town ladies who had welcomed her so warmly. Instead, a tall figure filled the doorway, silhouetted against the bright morning light. When he stepped inside, removing his hat, Lillian recognized him immediately as the cowboy she had seen upon her arrival, Thomas Tucker. Miss Everett. His voice was deep, with a slight drawl that marked him as a man who had spent most of his life in these territories. Mr. Tucker, she acknowledged, trying to ignore the unexpected flutter in her chest. Up close, he was even more striking, sun-bronzed skin, eyes the color of a summer sky, and a strong jawline shadowed with stubble. What brings you to the schoolhouse on a Sunday? He held up a leather-bound book. Martha mentioned you were concerned about the library here, thought you might be able to use this. Lillian accepted the offering, surprised to find a well-worn copy of Romeo and Juliet. Shakespeare, I wouldn't have expected. A hint of amusement crossed his face. That I can read. Or that I appreciate the classics. Heat rushed to Lillian's cheeks. Forgive me, Mr. Tucker. I didn't mean to imply, no offense taken, Miss Everett. He gestured to the book. My mother was a teacher before she married my father. She brought her books west with her and made sure my brothers and I had more than just cattle on our minds. Lillian ran her fingers over the worn leather cover. It's a generous loan. I'll make sure it's returned in the same condition. It's not a loan, it's a gift for the school. His eyes met hers, and something in his direct gaze made her heart skip. My mother would have wanted it that way. Thank you, she said softly. The children will benefit greatly. An awkward silence fell between them, broken only when Thomas cleared his throat. I should let you get back to your preparations. Good luck tomorrow. Some of those ranch kids can be a handful. I'm sure I can manage, Lillian replied, perhaps too quickly. I taught in Boston for 3 years before coming west. He smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his face and made him look younger. I don't doubt it, Miss Everett. You seem like a woman who can handle just about anything. He placed his hat back on his head. Even stagecoach robbers. Lillian's eyes widened. How did you word travels fast in small towns? He tipped his hat. I'm sorry about your locket. Martha mentioned it was important to you. Before she could respond, he turned and left, his spurs jingling softly with each step. Lillian stood in the empty schoolhouse, the copy of Romeo and Juliet still in her hands, wondering why her heart was beating so rapidly, and why she suddenly found herself wondering what color Thomas Tucker's hair was beneath his hat. Monday morning dawned bright and clear, and Lillian arrived at the schoolhouse early, her stomach fluttering with nerves. By 8 o'clock, 27 children ranging in age from 6 to 16 had filed into the classroom, eyeing their new teacher with varying degrees of curiosity and wariness. Good morning, Lillian greeted them, writing her name on the blackboard in neat script. I am Miss Everett, and I'm very pleased to meet all of you. A small girl in the front row raised her hand. Miss Everett, is it true you were robbed by outlaws on your way here? Lillian blinked in surprise. Yes, that's true, though I'm not sure how. Pa says Thomas Tucker's gone after the Jackson gang to get your locket back, a freckle-faced boy announced from the back row. Said he rode out before dawn yesterday. A chorus of excited whispers swept through the classroom, and Lillian felt the color drain from her face. That's quite enough gossip, she said firmly, though her mind was racing. Now, let's begin with introductions, shall we? The day passed in a blur of lessons and names, and by the time the last child had departed, Lillian was exhausted but exhilarated. These children were eager to learn, despite the limited resources available to them. As she was locking up the schoolhouse, Martha Winslow approached, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Thought you might be too tired to cook after your first day, Martha said, handing over the basket. Just some chicken and biscuits. That's very kind of you, Martha, thank you. Lillian hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in her mind all day. Is it true that Mr. Tucker has gone after the men who robbed the stagecoach? Martha's expression grew serious. I'm afraid so. Those Jackson boys have been terrorizing travelers for months now. Thomas has been trying to organize a proper posse, but the sheriff's getting on in years and hasn't been much help. But why would he risk himself for my locket? He doesn't even know me. That's just the kind of man he is, dear. His father was the same way, couldn't abide injustice, especially against women and children. Martha patted Lillian's arm. Try not to worry. Thomas knows this territory better than anyone, and he's not riding alone. His foreman and 2 of his best hands went with him. Lillian nodded, though worry gnawed at her. A man she barely knew was risking his life to recover a memento that, while precious to her, was certainly not worth dying for. That night, sleep eluded her. She sat by the window of her room at the boarding house, staring out at the star-strewn sky, wondering where Thomas Tucker was at that moment, and if he was safe. The realization that she cared about the answer troubled her deeply. 3 days passed with no word of Thomas or his men. Lillian threw herself into her teaching, introducing her students to Shakespeare through the donated copy of Romeo and Juliet, and organizing a small town gathering to raise funds for more books. Yet beneath her composed exterior, worry for the rancher's safety grew with each passing day. On Thursday afternoon, as Lillian was writing the next day's lessons on the blackboard, she heard the pounding of hooves outside. Children who had stayed late to help clean the schoolhouse rushed to the windows. It's Mr. Tucker, one of them shouted, and he's got someone tied to a horse. Lillian's heart leaped into her throat as she hurried outside. A small crowd had already gathered in the street as 4 riders approached, dust billowing around them. Thomas led the group, his face grim beneath his hat. Behind him, a man with his hands bound rode slumped in his saddle, while Thomas's men flanked the prisoner. As they reached the front of the sheriff's office, Thomas dismounted in one fluid motion. He spoke briefly to the aging lawman who had emerged from the building, then turned to scan the crowd. When his eyes found Lillian, something in his expression softened. He strode toward her, removing his hat as he approached. "Miss Everett." "Mr. Tucker," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're safe." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Were you concerned for my welfare?" "The entire town has been worried," she replied, unwilling to admit the extent of her own anxiety. "I hear you went after those men because of my locket." Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold locket, its chain repaired and polished to a shine. "I believe this belongs to you." Lillian stared at the familiar oval pendant resting in his palm, tears suddenly blurring her vision. "You found it. I can't believe you found it." "We caught up with 2 of the Jackson brothers about 60 miles south of here. The third got away, but he's the youngest, not the mastermind." Thomas held out the locket. "Your father's gift deserved to be returned to you." As Lillian reached for the locket, their fingers touched, and a jolt of awareness shot through her. "Thank you," she whispered, closing her hand around the precious keepsake. "But you shouldn't have risked yourself for this." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "Some things are worth the risk, Miss Everett." Before she could respond, the sheriff called for Thomas's help with the prisoner, and he excused himself with a tip of his hat. That evening, the town held an impromptu celebration at the saloon, with even some of the women and children attending to hear the tale of how Thomas and his men had tracked and captured the notorious Jackson brothers. Lillian sat at a table with Martha and Harold, watching as Thomas recounted the events with modest understatement, deflecting praise to his men. "Not exactly the quiet, bookish type you might have preferred back in Boston," Martha commented, following Lillian's gaze. "I don't have a preferred type," Lillian protested. "I'm not looking for romance of any kind." Martha's knowing smile only widened. "The heart doesn't always listen to what the head decides, dear." Later, as Lillian was preparing to leave, Thomas approached her table. "May I walk you back to the boarding house, Miss Everett? It's getting dark." Despite her better judgment, Lillian accepted. They walked in comfortable silence for a few moments before she spoke. "Mr. Tucker, I don't know how to thank you properly for what you've done." "There's no need for thanks. I'm just glad we recovered something so important to you." "The locket contains a small portrait of my father," Lillian explained, her fingers touching the pendant now safely restored to its place around her neck. "He died 3 years ago. I'm sorry for your loss." "I know how hard it is to lose a parent." In the soft glow of the evening lamps, his expression was gentle. "My father died when I was 21, left me the ranch and 3 younger brothers to look after. That must have been difficult," he shrugged. "It was what needed doing." "Family is everything out here." They reached the boarding house and Lillian turned to face him. "Mr. Tucker, Thomas," he corrected. "After retrieving your locket from armed outlaws, I think we can dispense with formalities, don't you?" A smile tugged at her lips. "Thomas, then, and I'm Lillian." "Lillian," he repeated, and the way her name sounded in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Would you do me the honor of joining me for dinner tomorrow evening, Mrs. Prescott is a fine cook, but I know a spot by the creek where the sunset makes the whole world look like it's made of gold." Every instinct told her to decline. She had come west to teach, not to entangle herself in a romance that could only end in heartache. And yet, "I would like that," she heard herself say. The smile that lit his face was worth the risk of eventual regret. "I'll call for you at 5 then." As he walked away, Lillian touched her locket again, wondering what her father would have thought of the tall cowboy with the honest eyes and the courage to face down outlaws for a stranger's keepsake. More troubling still, she wondered what her mother would say about the dangerous fluttering in her chest whenever Thomas was near. The next evening, Lillian found herself fussing over her appearance more than she had since arriving in Copper Creek. She finally settled on a dress of cornflower, blue that Martha had assured her brought out the color of her eyes, and pinned her honey-brown hair in a simpler style than her usual severe bun. Thomas arrived promptly at 5, mounted on his black stallion and leading a gentle mare for Lillian. "Hope you don't mind riding," he said. "The spot I want to show you is a little ways out of town." Lillian had learned to ride as a child during summers spent at her grandparents' country home in Vermont, but it had been years since she'd been on horseback. Thomas helped her mount with strong, steady hands at her waist, and the brief contact left her feeling strangely breathless. They rode at an easy pace out of town, following a trail that wound through stands of cottonwood trees toward a line of low hills to the west. Thomas pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the area, his obvious love for the land evident in every word. "My father came out here in '52 during the Silver Rush," he explained. "But he was smarter than most knew the real fortune was in cattle to feed all those miners. Started with just 20 head and built it up from there. And now it's yours," Lillian observed, "mine to steward at least for a time." He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "The land was here long before us and will be here long after. We're just passing through, trying to leave it better than we found it." The philosophical bent of his mind surprised her yet again. This man defied every preconception she had formed about frontier cowboys. They reached a small clearing beside a creek, just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. True to Thomas's word, the light transformed the landscape into a painter's dream of gold and amber hues. A blanket had already been spread beneath a large cottonwood, with a basket waiting nearby. "Your foreman," Lillian guessed as Thomas helped her dismount. He nodded. "Jake's been with my family since before I was born, thinks I work too hard and don't spend enough time enjoying life's pleasures." "A wise man," Lillian said with a smile. They settled on the blanket, and Thomas unpacked the basket: fried chicken, biscuits, apple pie, and a bottle of wine that he admitted had been borrowed from the town's saloon keeper. "I hope you don't mind the informality," he said as he poured the wine into tin cups. "Out here, we don't stand much on ceremony." "It's perfect," Lillian assured him, surprised to find she meant it. After years of rigid Boston propriety, there was something liberating about dining outdoors with a handsome cowboy as the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. As they ate, they shared stories of their lives. Thomas of growing up on the ranch with 3 wild brothers and a mother who insisted they all learn Shakespeare alongside roping and riding. Lillian of her childhood in Boston, her father's passion for books, and her mother's slow decline after his death. "Is that why you came west?" Thomas asked. "To escape those memories?" Lillian considered the question. "Partly, but also to find something I couldn't in Boston, a place where I could be useful, where what I know could make a real difference. And have you found it here in Copper Creek?" "I think I have," she said softly. "The children here are so eager to learn, so hungry for knowledge. In Boston, education was taken for granted. Here, it's treasured." Thomas raised his cup in a toast, "To finding what you're looking for." The sun had set, leaving the sky a deep purple canvas scattered with stars. Thomas built a small fire to ward off the evening chill, and they sat side by side, the flames casting dancing shadows on their faces. "May I ask you something, Thomas?" Lillian ventured, emboldened by the wine and the intimacy of the setting. "Anything?" "Mrs. Prescott mentioned that you were once engaged to be married, but your fiancé died of fever." She hesitated. "Is that true?" A shadow crossed his face. "Not exactly. Rebecca and I were sweethearts, not officially engaged. She was the daughter of a neighboring rancher. We grew up together, always assumed we'd marry someday." He poked at the fire with a stick. "When the fever came through 5 years ago, it took her and her entire family within a week." "I'm so sorry," Lillian whispered. "It was a hard time. Lost my father the same year, different causes, but the grief compounded." His eyes reflected the firelight as he looked at her. "Is that why you've been holding yourself at a distance? You heard I was pining for a lost love." Lillian flushed, embarrassed that he had seen through her so easily. "No, it's all right," he said gently. "Small towns run on gossip. For what it's worth, I mourned Rebecca deeply, but life goes on. It has to." "Does it?" Lillian's voice was barely audible. "My mother never recovered from my father's death. She simply faded away. I watched love destroy her, Thomas. I promised myself I would never be that vulnerable." Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "Your mother loved deeply. That's a gift, not a tragedy." The pain she felt was the mirror of the joy they shared in life. But what's the point of such joy if it leads to such devastation? Would you refuse to ride because you might fall, or avoid the rain because you could get wet? His hand found hers in the firelight. Love isn't a fool's game, Lillian. It's the only game worth playing, even knowing the risks. His touch sent warmth spiraling through her, more potent than the wine or the fire. When he leaned closer, his intention clear in his eyes, Lillian knew she should pull away but found herself meeting him halfway instead. His lips were warm and gentle on hers, the kiss tentative at first, then deepening as she responded. His hand came up to cup her cheek, and Lillian felt something inside her shift and realign, as if pieces of herself she hadn't known were missing suddenly fell into place. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the moment I saw you standing in that schoolhouse," he admitted. Lillian's heart raced. "This is madness, we barely know each other." "Then let's remedy that," he smiled, the firelight catching in his eyes. "I want to know everything about you, Lillian Everett. Your hopes, your fears, your favorite books, how you take your coffee in the morning, all of it." "What if," she swallowed hard, "what if this ends badly?" "What if it doesn't?" he countered. "What if this is the beginning of something wonderful?" The ride back to town was quiet, but a comfortable quiet filled with stolen glances and shy smiles. Thomas helped her dismount outside the boarding house, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "May I call on you again?" he asked, though the answer was already evident in her eyes. "I would like that very much," Lillian replied. As she watched him ride away, Lillian touched her lips, still feeling the ghost of his kiss. The walls she had built around her heart since her mother's death felt less solid now, crumbling at the edges in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The following weeks brought a transformation to Lillian's life in Copper Creek. By day, she taught her students with renewed enthusiasm, introducing them to literature, mathematics, and science with creative approaches that soon had even the most reluctant learners engaged. By evening, she often found herself in Thomas's company riding along the creek, sharing dinner with his brothers at the ranch, or simply walking through town as the sun set. The townsfolk noticed, of course. Martha Winslow's knowing smiles grew more pronounced, and Mrs. Prescott took to humming wedding marches whenever Thomas came to call at the boarding house. Even Lillian's students began to giggle when the rancher appeared at the schoolhouse door to walk their teacher home. One Saturday in late October, Thomas invited Lillian to join him for the annual harvest dance at the town hall. "Nothing fancy," he assured her, "but the whole town turns out. Good food, music, dancing under the stars." "I'd love to attend with you," Lillian said, wondering what her former Boston acquaintances would think of her now dancing at a frontier harvest festival with a cowboy who made her heart race with a mere glance. The night of the dance arrived crisp and clear, with a full moon hanging low in the sky. Thomas called for Lillian in a wagon rather than on horseback, dressed in his Sunday best dark trousers, a crisp white shirt, and a vest that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. "You look beautiful," he said when she appeared in a dress of deep green that Martha had helped her alter for the occasion. "Thank you." Lillian accepted his hand as he helped her into the wagon. "You clean up rather nicely yourself, Mr. Tucker." The town hall was transformed with autumn decorations, dried corn stalks, pumpkins, and paper lanterns strung from the rafters. A small band played lively tunes at one end of the room, while tables laden with food lined the other. Nearly everyone in Copper Creek and the surrounding ranches had turned out for the celebration. Thomas led Lillian through the crowd, introducing her to those she hadn't yet met through her teaching duties. His pride in escorting her was evident in every introduction, every touch of his hand at the small of her back, every smile he directed her way. "May I have this dance?" he asked as the band struck up a waltz. Lillian placed her hand in his. "I should warn you, I was never the most graceful dancer at Boston socials. Fortunately, I have enough grace for both of us," he teased, leading her onto the floor with confidence, and he did. For a man who spent most of his days on horseback or mending fences, Thomas moved with surprising elegance. He guided Lillian through the steps with a light touch and watchful eye, anticipating her movements and adjusting his own to complement them. "Where did you learn to dance like this?" she asked, breathless from both the exertion and the proximity. My mother insisted all her sons learn proper social graces, said just because we lived on the frontier didn't mean we had to behave like savages. His eyes twinkled with amusement. My brothers and I spent many Sunday afternoons practicing with each other while she played the piano. We complained bitterly, but now I'm grateful. As the evening progressed, Lillian found herself relaxing into the festive atmosphere. She danced not only with Thomas but with Harold Winslow, the sheriff, and several of the fathers of her students. During a particularly energetic reel, she caught sight of Thomas watching her from across the room, his expression so full of admiration and something deeper that it made her breath catch. Later, as the celebration began to wind down, Thomas suggested they step outside for some air. The night had grown cooler, and he draped his jacket around her shoulders as they walked toward a small gazebo that had been built in the town square the previous spring. "Are you enjoying yourself?" he asked as they sat on a bench within the shelter. "More than I expected to," Lillian admitted. "Everyone has been so welcoming since I arrived, but tonight I truly felt like part of the community. You are part of it now." Thomas took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Copper Creek is better for having you here." Lillian looked up at him, studying the strong lines of his face in the moonlight. "And what about you, Thomas? Is your life better for having me in it?" His expression grew serious. "More than I can express. These past weeks with you, Lillian, I've never felt this way about anyone before." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Not even Rebecca. What I felt for Rebecca was the affection of childhood, comfortable and expected. This," he gestured between them, "this is different, deeper. When I'm with you, I feel more alive, more myself than I ever have." "I'm afraid," Lillian confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "The way I feel when I'm with you, it's overwhelming. If I lost you, you won't lose me." He cupped her face in his hands. "I can't promise we won't face hardships. Life out here guarantees that. But I can promise to face them at your side, to be your partner in all things if you'll have me. Thomas, I love you, Lillian Everett. I think I've loved you since I first saw you standing in that schoolhouse, looking so determined and capable and beautiful." His blue eyes held hers, unflinching in their honesty. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight, just for you to consider a future with me." Lillian felt tears well in her eyes. "I've spent so long guarding my heart, convinced that love only leads to pain. And now I think perhaps the pain only comes because the love was real and precious." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "I love you too, Thomas. It terrifies me, but I can't deny it any longer." His smile could have outshone the moon as he drew her into his arms, his kiss tender yet passionate. Lillian melted against him, all her doubts momentarily forgotten in the certainty of his embrace. A throat cleared nearby, and they broke apart to find Martha Winslow standing at the entrance to the gazebo, her expression a mixture of amusement and embarrassment. "I hate to interrupt, but Harold's ready to head home, and we promised to give you a ride back to the boarding house, Lillian." "Of course," Lillian said, flustered. "I'll be right there." When Martha tactfully retreated, Thomas chuckled. "I suppose that's my cue to bid you good night." He helped her to her feet, "though I'd much rather continue our conversation." "There will be time for that," Lillian assured him, returning his jacket. Tomorrow," he agreed. "I'll come by after church." That night, as Lillian prepared for bed, she caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror above her dresser. The woman who looked back at her seemed different somehow, her eyes brighter, her expression softer. Was this what love did to a person? If so, perhaps her mother's fate was not the inevitable conclusion of giving one's heart to another. For the first time since her father's death, Lillian allowed herself to imagine a future filled with joy rather than merely duty, a future with Thomas Tucker at her side. The following weeks brought a deepening of their relationship as autumn gave way to the first chill of winter. Thomas became a regular visitor at the schoolhouse, often arriving as classes ended to help with repairs to the building or simply to walk Lillian home. On weekends, he took her riding across the vast expanse of the Tucker Ranch, showing her favorite spots: a hidden waterfall, a grove of ancient oaks, the ridge where his father had first decided to stake his claim. As November drew to a close, Thomas invited Lillian to join his family for Thanksgiving dinner at the ranch house. "Fair warning," he said with a grin. "My brothers can be a rowdy bunch, but they're eager to meet the woman who's stolen their eldest brother's heart." "Are you certain they'll approve of me?" Lillian asked, suddenly nervous at the prospect of meeting Thomas's family in such an official capacity. "They've already approved based solely on my descriptions." He kissed her forehead. "Just wait until they meet you in person. They'll wonder how I managed to win the affections of someone so far above my station." Thanksgiving Day dawned cold but clear. Thomas arrived at the boarding house in a buckboard wagon lined with blankets against the chill. The ride to the Tucker Ranch took nearly an hour, giving Lillian ample time to admire the vast property that stretched in all directions, rolling grasslands dotted with cattle, stands of cottonwood and oak, and in the distance, the blue silhouette of mountains. The ranch house itself was larger than Lillian had expected, a sprawling two-story structure built of logs and local stone, with a wide porch wrapping around three sides. Smoke curled from two chimneys, and the windows glowed with welcoming light. "It's beautiful," Lillian breathed as Thomas helped her down from the wagon. "My father built the original cabin himself, but my mother insisted on expanding as the family grew." Pride was evident in his voice. "4 boys need a lot of space, apparently." Before they reached the porch, the front door burst open and 3 young men spilled out, each bearing a strong resemblance to Thomas, though none quite matching his height. "She's real," the youngest exclaimed with a grin. "We were beginning to think Thomas had invented you." "Ignore Timothy," Thomas said with a long-suffering sigh. "He was dropped on his head as an infant." He turned to Lillian. "My brother's Timothy, the youngest and least mannered, Theodore, the middle son and our best horse trainer, and Tobias, second eldest and the brains of the family." Each brother removed his hat as he was introduced, offering Lillian varying degrees of gallant bows that made her laugh despite her nerves. "It's a pleasure to meet you all," she said. "Thomas speaks of you often." "All lies, I'm sure," Tobias replied with a wink. "Come inside before you freeze." "Mrs. Holloway has been cooking since dawn, and the house smells like heaven itself." The interior of the ranch house was as impressive as the exterior, a great room with a massive stone fireplace, comfortable furnishings that showed signs of use by the 4 brothers, and bookshelves filled with volumes that would have been the envy of many Boston homes. Family portraits and Western landscapes adorned the walls, and a piano stood in one corner, its surface covered with sheet music. Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper who had helped raise the boys after their mother's death, greeted Lillian with a warm embrace. "About time Thomas brought you out to meet the family," she declared. "I was beginning to think he was ashamed of us." "Never that," Thomas assured her. "I was simply saving the best for last." The Thanksgiving meal was served at a long oak table in the dining room, the surface nearly invisible beneath platters of roast turkey, mashed potatoes, sweet corn, fresh bread, and 3 different kinds of pie. Conversation flowed easily, with the brothers sharing stories of their childhood that had Thomas alternately laughing and groaning with embarrassment. "Did he tell you about the time he tried to tame a wild Mustang when he was 14? Theodore asked, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "No, he failed to mention that," Lillian replied, glancing at Thomas with raised eyebrows. "That's because there's nothing to tell," Thomas insisted. "I succeeded in taming him, after he dragged you half a mile through cactus patches," Tobias corrected. "Ma had to spend hours picking spines out of places I won't mention in mixed company." The laughter that followed was warm and inclusive, making Lillian feel as though she had known this family for years rather than hours. As the meal progressed, she found herself relaxing into their easy camaraderie, offering stories of her own Boston upbringing and answering the brothers' curious questions about life in the East. After dinner, Timothy convinced Lillian to play the piano while the family gathered around to sing familiar hymns and folk songs. Though her skills were modest compared to some of the accomplished musicians she had known in Boston, the Tucker brothers applauded with genuine appreciation. As the evening grew late, Thomas suggested he should take Lillian back to town before the temperature dropped further. His brothers protested, but Mrs. Holloway firmly reminded them that their guest had school to teach in the morning. "You're welcome here anytime, Miss Everett," the housekeeper said as she helped Lillian with her coat. "It's been too long since these walls heard a woman's laughter." The ride back to town was quiet, both of them wrapped in blankets against the cold night air. Lillian leaned against Thomas's solid warmth, feeling a contentment she hadn't experienced in years. "Thank you for today," she said softly. "Your family is wonderful. They adore you," Thomas replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Almost as much as I do." "It felt right being there with all of you." Lillian hesitated, then added, "It felt like home." Thomas's arm tightened around her. "It could be, your home, I mean." Lillian's heart skipped a beat at the implication. "Thomas." "I'm not proposing right this minute," he assured her with a soft chuckle. "Though I admit the thought has crossed my mind more than once. I just want you to know that whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, there's a place for you at Tucker Ranch." Lillian was silent for a long moment, watching their breath form clouds in the cold air. "I used to think love was a fool's game," she finally said. "That giving your heart to someone meant inevitably losing yourself when they left. And now I think perhaps the only foolish thing is to deny love when it finds you out of fear of what might happen." She turned to look at him, his features shadowed in the moonlight. "I'm not afraid anymore, Thomas." He reined the horses to a halt, turning to face her fully. "Lillian Everett, are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that I love you, and the thought of a future without you in it seems unbearable." She smiled through sudden tears. "I'm saying yes to whatever you're asking whenever you decide to ask it." His kiss was gentle at first, then deepening with promise as he pulled her closer. When they finally broke apart, his eyes shone with such joy that Lillian felt her heart might burst from the sheer force of her love for this man. "We should get you back before Mrs. Prescott sends out a search party," Thomas said reluctantly, flicking the reins to set the horses moving again. "Yes," Lillian agreed, though she made no attempt to move from the circle of his arm. "We have time, after all the time in the world." As they continued toward town, the stars stretched endlessly above them, and Lillian silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought her to this place. To this man who had shown her that love wasn't a fool's game after all, it was the greatest adventure of all. The winter of 1875 proved to be one of the coldest in recent memory for the Arizona Territory. Snow blanketed Copper Creek twice before Christmas, an unusual occurrence that delighted Lillian's students but complicated travel between the town and outlying ranches. Despite the challenging weather, Thomas made the journey to see her nearly every day, sometimes arriving at the schoolhouse with frost coating his beard and eyebrows. "You're going to catch your death riding in this weather," Lillian scolded one particularly bitter afternoon as she helped him remove his ice-encrusted coat. "Worth it," he replied simply, warming his hands by the schoolroom stove before pulling her into an embrace that melted any remaining resistance. As Christmas approached, the town buzzed with preparations for the holiday. Lillian organized her students for a Christmas pageant to be performed at the church, while Martha Winslow coordinated a community feast to follow the performance. "You'll join us at the ranch for Christmas Day, won't you?" Thomas asked as they walked through town one evening, admiring the simple decorations that adorned the buildings. "Mrs. Holloway is already planning the menu, and my brothers have threatened bodily harm if I don't bring you." "I'd love to," Lillian replied, her heart warming at being included in his family's celebration. "Though I should warn you, I've purchased gifts for all of you, and they may require extra space in your wagon." Thomas laughed. "And here I thought teachers were supposed to be practical and frugal." "I've been saving my salary for something special," she admitted. "This is my first Christmas away from Boston, and I want it to be memorable." His expression softened as he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "It already is because you're here." The Christmas pageant was a resounding success, with even the most reluctant students performing their parts with enthusiasm. Lillian watched from the side of the church as the children enacted the nativity scene, their faces solemn with the importance of their roles. When they finished with a somewhat uneven but heartfelt rendition of Silent Night, there wasn't a dry eye in the congregation. "You've worked wonders with those children," Thomas whispered as he joined her for the community feast afterward. "Half of them wouldn't say 2 words in public before you came." "They just needed someone to believe in them," Lillian replied, watching as her students proudly accepted compliments from parents and neighbors. The feast lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing following the meal. As the celebration wound down, Thomas drew Lillian aside, his expression unusually serious. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon. "I know Christmas isn't until tomorrow, but I wanted to give you this privately." Curious, Lillian untied the ribbon and carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a small velvet box that made her breath catch in her throat. With trembling fingers, she opened it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "Thomas," she breathed, looking up to find him watching her intently. "It was my mother's," he explained. "My father gave it to her when they decided to leave civilization behind and build a life together in this wild country." He took the box from her hands and removed the ring. "I can think of no one who embodies her spirit of adventure and love more than you do." He dropped to one knee before her, heedless of the packed earth floor of the church hall. "Lillian Everett, you came west seeking purpose and found your place in our community, in our school, and in my heart. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Tears blurred Lillian's vision as she looked down at this man who had changed her life in ways she never could have imagined just months ago. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Thomas, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit as if it had been made for her, then rose to gather her in his arms. Their kiss was interrupted by applause and cheers. The remaining townspeople had witnessed the proposal and were now surrounding them with congratulations and well wishes. Martha Winslow was among the first to embrace Lillian. "I knew from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach that you belonged here," she said, wiping away tears of her own. "And I suspected it wouldn't be long before Thomas recognized it too." The news of their engagement spread through Copper Creek like wildfire. By Christmas morning, when Thomas arrived to take Lillian to the ranch, it seemed everyone in town had stopped by the boarding house with gifts and congratulations. Christmas at the Tucker Ranch was everything Lillian could have hoped for: a roaring fire in the great stone hearth, a magnificent tree cut from the property and decorated with handmade ornaments, and the warm embrace of a family that had already accepted her as one of their own. The brothers' reaction to their engagement gifts books carefully selected for each of their interests was enthusiastic, but it was Thomas's response to her gift that Lillian would remember most vividly. She had commissioned a Boston artist friend to create a portrait of the Tucker Ranch house based on her descriptions and sketches, capturing the beauty of the place Thomas loved so dearly. "It's perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion as he studied the painting. "How did you manage this?" "I wrote to my friend Sarah the day after my first visit here," Lillian explained. "I wanted you to see your home through the eyes of someone who loves it almost as much as you do." His kiss expressed what words could not, and Lillian knew in that moment that she had made the right decision in opening her heart to this man, this family, this life. As winter slowly gave way to spring, wedding plans took shape alongside Lillian's teaching duties. The entire town seemed invested in the upcoming nuptials, with offers of help pouring in from every direction. Martha volunteered to coordinate the wedding feast, Harold promised to build an arch for the ceremony, and Mrs. Prescott insisted on sewing Lillian's dress herself. "You'll be the most beautiful bride Copper Creek has ever seen," the widow declared as she took Lillian's measurements. "Though I suspect Thomas would marry you if you wore a potato sack." "That's fortunate," Lillian laughed, "since my teaching salary doesn't allow for much extravagance." "Nonsense. Every bride deserves to feel like a queen on her wedding day." Mrs. Prescott paused, her expression growing wistful. "My Henry always said our wedding day was the happiest of his life, even though we had nothing but a borrowed dress and a cake my mother made." Lillian squeezed the older woman's hand. "Then I would be honored to wear whatever you create for me." The dress, when completed, was a masterpiece of ivory silk and delicate lace that Mrs. Prescott revealed had been saved from her own wedding gown. "Something old," she explained with a wink. Every bride needs that for luck. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in May, when the desert would be briefly transformed by spring blooms. As the date approached, Lillian found herself caught between excitement and a lingering fear that her happiness might somehow be snatched away. "What troubles you?" Thomas asked one evening as they sat on the porch of the boarding house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Nothing important," Lillian tried to dismiss his concern, but Thomas knew her too well now. "Tell me," he insisted gently. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Lillian sighed, searching for words to explain the nameless dread that sometimes gripped her in quiet moments. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," she finally admitted. "For some catastrophe to strike, or for you to change your mind, or—" "I don't know, it seems too perfect, and perfect things don't last." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "My father used to say that happiness isn't about waiting for storms to pass, it's about learning to dance in the rain." He turned to face her fully. "There will be storms, Lillian. Life guarantees that, but we'll weather them together and find joy in the journey nonetheless." "How did you get so wise?" she asked, leaning into his strength. "I had excellent teachers," he replied with a smile, "and the good sense to listen to them." 3 days before the wedding, a telegram arrived from Boston that threatened to cast a shadow over the celebration. Lillian's aunt, her mother's sister and only remaining family, wrote that she was gravely ill and wished to see Lillian one last time. "You should go," Thomas said without hesitation when Lillian showed him the message. "Family is important and you'll regret it if you don't say goodbye, but the wedding will wait. I've waited my whole life to find you, Lillian. A few more weeks won't matter." The decision was made quickly. Lillian would take the next eastbound train, visit her aunt, and return as soon as possible. The wedding would be postponed until early June, when the weather would still be mild enough for an outdoor ceremony. "Are you certain you don't mind?" Lillian asked Thomas the night before her departure, worry creasing her brow. "I mind being separated from you," he admitted, "but I understand the importance of family. Go with my blessing and come back to me when you can." The journey east was long and tiring, but Lillian found comfort in the knowledge that Thomas and their future awaited her return. She arrived in Boston to find her aunt indeed gravely ill but still lucid enough to recognize her niece. "You look different," Aunt Alina observed from her sick. "There's a light in your eyes I haven't seen since before your father passed." "I've found happiness," Lillian told her, describing Copper Creek, her teaching position, and most of all Thomas, a cowboy. Aunt Alina's eyebrows rose skeptically. "Your mother would have had apoplexy." "He's more than that," Lillian defended. "He's educated, kind, responsible, everything father would have approved of in a son-in-law." To her surprise, her aunt smiled. "Your father would have approved of anyone who put that spark back in your eyes, my dear, and your mother." "Well, she would have come around eventually." Alina lasted another week, slipping away peacefully in her sleep with Lillian at her bedside. The funeral was small. Most of their family connections had drifted away after Lillian's parents died, but dignified, as befitted a woman who had lived her life with quiet grace. Settling her aunt's affairs took longer than Lillian had anticipated. The small house had to be sold, possessions sorted, and legal matters addressed. Through it all, Thomas's letters arrived regularly, full of news from Copper Creek and assurances of his unwavering love. "The ranch misses you almost as much as I do," he wrote in one. "The wildflowers are blooming where we rode last autumn, and I find myself thinking of how your eyes light up when you discover something new about this land." In another, "My brothers ask about you daily, as if I might be hiding you somewhere on the property. Mrs. Holloway has started planning the wedding feast again, convinced you'll return any day now, and I count the hours until I can hold you in my arms again." Finally, nearly a month after her aunt's passing, Lillian boarded a westbound train, her heart lighter than it had been since leaving Arizona. She carried with her a trunk containing her aunt's wedding china, several family heirlooms, and a substantial inheritance that Alina had left her money that would allow her and Thomas to expand the ranch house as they planned for their future together. The journey west seemed interminable, each mile stretching longer than the last as her anticipation grew. When the train finally pulled into the station nearest Copper Creek, Lillian scanned the platform eagerly for Thomas's familiar figure. Instead, she saw Timothy, Thomas's youngest brother, waiting beside a wagon. Her heart dropped as she stepped down from the train. "Timothy, where's Thomas? Is something wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Timothy assured her quickly. "There was trouble with some rustlers up at the north pasture. Thomas wanted to be here, but he couldn't get away. He made me promise to bring you straight to the ranch." Relief flooded through her. "The ranch, but my things at the boarding house already taken care of," Timothy grinned. "Martha and Mrs. Prescott packed everything up last week. Said it was time you moved to where you belong." The ride to the ranch seemed to take forever, though Timothy kept her entertained with stories of what she had missed during her absence. When they finally crested the hill that overlooked the Tucker property, Lillian gasped at the sight that greeted her. The entire area around the ranch house had been transformed. Lanterns hung from trees, flowers decorated every available surface, and a white arch stood in the center of the yard. People milled about townsfolk she recognized from Copper Creek, neighboring ranchers, and at the center of it all, Thomas, resplendent in a new suit, watching the road anxiously. "What is all this?" Lillian asked, her voice barely a whisper. Timothy's grin widened. "Your wedding, Miss Everett. If you're still willing." Tears filled her eyes as Timothy helped her down from the wagon. The moment her feet touched the ground, Thomas was there, gathering her into his arms as if he might never let her go. "You're here," he breathed against her hair. "Finally, you're here." "Thomas, what have you done?" She pulled back to look at him, taking in the decorations, the gathering crowd, the obvious preparations for a celebration. "I couldn't wait another day," he admitted. "When your letter arrived saying you'd be on today's train, I started making arrangements. Everyone helped, the whole town, my brothers, even the weather cooperated." He searched her face anxiously. "Are you angry? We can postpone again if you'd prefer a proper ceremony later." Lillian laughed through her tears, her heart so full it might burst. "Angry? How could I be angry at the most romantic gesture anyone has ever made for me?" She glanced down at her travel-worn dress. "Though I'm hardly dressed for a wedding. That's been taken care of too." Martha Winslow approached, carrying a familiar white box. "Mrs. Prescott finished your dress weeks ago. It's waiting in Thomas's mother's old room, along with everything else you might need." An hour later, dressed in the ivory silk gown that Mrs. Prescott had so lovingly created, Lillian stood before the white arch with Thomas at her side. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the gathering as the minister from Copper Creek's small church led them through their vows. "I, Thomas James Tucker, take you, Lillian Grace Everett, to be my lawfully wedded wife." Thomas's voice rang clear and strong, his eyes never leaving hers. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." When it was her turn, Lillian's voice wavered only slightly as she repeated the ancient promises, sealing her commitment to this man who had shown her that love was not a weakness but the greatest strength of all. "By the power vested in me," the minister concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Thomas's kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise of all that was to come. As they turned to face their friends and family, now officially introduced as Mr. and Mrs. Tucker, Lillian felt a profound sense of rightness wash over her. This was where she belonged, not in a Boston drawing room or even a frontier schoolhouse, but at this man's side, building a life together in this wild, beautiful land. The celebration lasted well into the night, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed half the territory. As darkness fell, lanterns illuminated the yard, casting a warm glow over the festivities. Lillian danced not only with her new husband but with each of her brothers-in-law, Harold Winslow, the sheriff, and many of the fathers of her students. "Are you happy, Mrs. Tucker?" Thomas asked when he finally reclaimed her for a waltz beneath the stars. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she replied, resting her head against his chest as they swayed to the music. "And you, I have everything I could ever want right here in my arms." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Though I should warn you, I have one more surprise for tonight." When the last guests had departed and the brothers had tactfully retreated to the bunkhouse for the night, Thomas led Lillian to a part of the house she hadn't seen before, a new wing extending from the main structure. "I started building it the day after you accepted my proposal," he explained as he opened the door. "Wanted it to be ready when you returned." Inside was a spacious bedroom furnished with a mix of Western practicality and Eastern refinement, a massive four-poster bed, a dressing table that looked suspiciously like one she had admired in the general store's catalog, and bookshelves already filled with volumes she recognized from her own collection. "It's perfect," she whispered, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "But how did you know what I would like?" "I had help," he admitted with a smile. "Martha and Mrs. Prescott had very definite opinions about what a lady from Boston would expect in her bedchamber. And I added a few touches of my own." He led her to a door at the far end of the room, opening it to reveal a small study complete with a desk, more bookshelves, and a comfortable chair positioned to catch the morning light. "For your lesson plans," he explained. "And any other writing you might want to do. I remember you mentioning that you used to enjoy composing stories as a girl." Tears filled Lillian's eyes at this evidence of how well he knew her, how thoughtfully he had prepared for their life together. "Thomas Tucker, you continue to surprise me." "I hope to do so for many years to come." He drew her into his arms, his expression growing serious. "I know this life isn't what you were raised to expect, Lillian. It's harder in many ways, more isolated, less refined than Boston society. But I promise to do everything in my power to make you happy here." "I am happy here," she assured him, reaching up to touch his face. "Happier than I've ever been. This is where I belong, Thomas, with you in this house on this land. You've given me not just a home, but a future filled with possibility." His kiss was gentle at first, then deepening with a passion that had been held in check through the long weeks of their separation. As he lifted her into his arms to carry her to their marriage bed, Lillian knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true place in the world, not in the carefully ordered drawing rooms of Boston, but here in the wild Arizona territory, with a man who had taught her that love was the greatest adventure of all. 5 years later, Lillian sat on the wide porch of the Tucker Ranch house, watching as Thomas taught their 3-year-old son James to ride his first pony. The little boy, a miniature version of his father with Lillian's honey-brown hair, clung to the saddle with determined concentration, his face lighting up with delight when the gentle mare took a few steps forward. "Look, Mama, I'm riding," James called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "I see you, darling. You're doing wonderfully," Lillian called back, adjusting the sleeping infant in her arms. Eleanor, named for Lillian's aunt, was barely 3 months old with a tuft of dark hair and her father's striking blue eyes. So much had changed in 5 years. The ranch had prospered under Thomas's management, allowing them to expand both the house and their holdings. Lillian had continued teaching until James's birth, then reluctantly handed over the schoolroom to a young woman from Denver who shared her passion for education. Now she divided her time between her children, the ranch accounts, and a series of children's stories based on life in the West that a Boston publisher had expressed interest in printing. Thomas's brothers had undergone transformations of their own. Tobias had married Martha Winslow's niece and established his own smaller ranch on adjoining property. Theodore had taken over training horses not just for the Tucker Ranch, but for buyers as far away as California. And Timothy, the youngest, had surprised everyone by announcing his intention to study medicine in St. Louis, returning to Copper Creek during school breaks with increasingly impressive knowledge that had already saved several lives in the community. As Thomas helped James dismount and sent the boy running toward the porch with proud tales of his riding prowess, Lillian reflected on how differently her life had turned out from what she had once planned. The cautious, heartbroken young woman who had stepped off that stagecoach 5 years ago, convinced that love was a fool's game, seemed like a stranger now. "You're looking thoughtful, Mrs. Tucker," Thomas observed as he joined her on the porch, scooping James up for a congratulatory embrace before settling beside Lillian. "Just counting my blessings," she replied, leaning into his solid warmth as he draped an arm around her shoulders. "And how many have you counted so far?" He asked, gently stroking Aliner's cheek as the baby slept peacefully in her mother's arms. "Too many to number," Lillian admitted. "Though I believe you and these little ones top the list." James squirmed free of his father's grasp, intent on telling his Uncle Theodore about his riding accomplishment. As the boy raced toward the stables, Thomas pressed a kiss to Lillian's temple. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Leaving Boston, marrying a rough cowboy, building a life out here where the comforts are fewer and the work is harder." Lillian turned to face him, struck anew by the depth of feeling she saw in his eyes. 5 years of marriage had only strengthened the bond between them, each challenge faced together cementing their partnership in ways she couldn't have imagined. "Not for a single moment," she said with absolute conviction. "You taught me the most valuable lesson of my life, Thomas Tucker." "And what lesson was that?" he asked, his smile warming her to her core. "That love isn't a fool's game after all." She leaned forward to press her lips to his. "It's the only game worth playing, even knowing the risks." As the Arizona sun sank toward the horizon, painting the land in shades of gold and amber, Lillian Tucker held her daughter close and watched her son's exuberant return from the stables. Beside her, the cowboy who had ridden into her life and changed it forever squeezed her hand, a silent affirmation of all they had built together and all that still lay ahead. The walls she had built around her heart after her parents' deaths had crumbled long ago, replaced by the solid foundation of a love that grew stronger with each passing day. And in that love, Lillian had found not the weakness she once feared, but a strength that would carry them through whatever challenges the future might hold.